this is Jen, and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices, and more to help you get top grades. So I recently did a poll on the topics that you guys find most interesting, and the one that came out top was how to use secondary criticism in your own essays. So this is great because it's definitely a super important skill for top grade literature students to master. So I'll start this video by briefly explaining what literary criticism is, what is its role in literary studies, and then move on to give you 3 steps to using LitCrit in your own essays, and finally wrap up with a quick demonstration of how I would use 2 sets of literary criticism in an essay on Macbeth. This is a video for top grade lit learners, so if you want top grades in lit, make sure you sit through the entire video to get all of the good stuff. Let's start by clarifying the difference between primary texts and secondary texts. In literature, primary texts refer to the original creative works, like novels, short stories, poems, plays, or even personal essays. In most cases, they should be the focus of any literature course, which is why we tend to regard dramatists like Shakespeare, novelists like Jane Austen, poets like Percy Bysshe Shelley, or even essayists like Joan Didion as primary text authors. When it comes to secondary texts, as the name itself would suggest, these are the critical responses to original creative works, otherwise known as literary criticism. Often, we refer to people who write literary criticism as literary critics, but that's not to say that they are always critical about literature in a negative, detractive way. Remember, criticism in literature simply means a professional evaluation and appreciation of written works. Essentially, all English professors are by default literary critics, and in fact, you as an English Lit student are also a literary critic every time you write an essay analysing a literary text. Professional literary critics are often categorised according to different literary theories or approaches, such as feminist, post-colonial, historicist, structuralist, psychoanalytical, Marxist, etc., etc. And if you want, I can actually go into detail about each of these theories in future videos, so please comment below to let me know if this is something you would like to see. Now, literary criticism can be a divisive topic in literary studies. It's kind of like Marmite. You either love it and see it as its own field of literary genre, or you hate it and can't see the point of reading dense academic prose that doesn't ever seem to lead anywhere. But love it or hate it, being able to incorporate critical views in your own analysis can help you gain higher marks, as it shows sophisticated engagement with literary texts. And if you're planning on studying literature at a higher level, for example at university, literary criticism will be a regular presence on your course. In general though, literary criticism carries great value in that it preserves the intellectual tradition of a culture, and it also helps us appreciate how language transcends time and space to communicate universal ideas about human nature and existence. To use a travel analogy, creative works are like beautiful exotic cities steeped in history, culture, and their own unique customs, while critical works are like the tour guides, who curate for us the local highlights, uncover the hidden alleyways, and decipher the mystique of the sights and attractions to give us a more enlightened experience. Technically, this is what LitCrit should do, and indeed what good LitCrit does do. But of course, there are such literary critics who confuse more than clarify with their obfuscating and convoluted prose. Judith Butler. So it's important that we separate the wheat from the chaff, and as a general rule, criticism that's unnecessarily dense and jargonistic tends to be bad criticism, so don't be fooled by the linguistic tomfoolery. So now that we know what literary criticism means and why we need to engage with it, here are 3 steps to incorporating LitCrit in your own analysis. So they say the first rule of Fight Club is that you don't talk about Fight Club. Well, I say the first rule of using literary criticism is that you don't actually focus on the literary criticism. Because at the end of the day, it's your analysis and your essay. So your view on the novel, play, or poem is the point, not the critics. Now, once upon a time when I first came to know about LitCrit, I was so enchanted with the seeming sophistication of it all, I would turn all my essays into an echo chamber of everyone else's opinions on a text, in the process completely neglecting to express my own thoughts. Over time, I've learned through the hard way that the right thing to do is to read a good amount of quality secondary criticism around a topic or a text, and then identify opposing, meaningful critical viewpoints, and finally evaluate where you stand between them. This brings us to the next step. How do we go about finding opposing views in this wild west of literary criticism? The way to do this is to understand a critic's angle and approach, which usually stems from their theoretical or ideological agenda. So ask yourself, is the critic a historicist, someone who reads literature as a product of historical developments, or a feminist, someone who reads literature for gender tensions and power dynamics? A structuralist, someone who reads literature as a compendium of codes, signs, and structures? A psychoanalyst, someone who reads literature through the lens of psychoanalysis and psychiatric ideas? Or a Marxist, someone who reads literature for systems of class struggle between the haves and have-nots, or the capitalists versus the proletarians. Now, even for critics who don't seem to come from a specific theoretical discipline, they still have an agenda. For instance, if a critic were to only focus on what's presented in the text, i.e. the language, form, devices, in the process ignoring whatever contextual influences that may have gone into the writing of the text, then that makes them a textualist or an essentialist. In literary scholarship, this is often referred to as practical criticism, otherwise known as close reading, which is the approach that most schools tend to teach. Now, once you figure out where a certain critic is coming from, you should then be able to discern what other types of critics are likely to disagree with this critic, and most importantly, decide whether or not you agree with their respective views vis-a-vis the text you're analysing. For a deeper understanding of critical approaches and theoretical angles, I recommend Mary Kladger's Key Terms in Literary Theory, which is a comprehensive glossary of advanced literary concepts, and I will link to her book in the description box below. By the way, guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel, and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English Lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature. Now, it may sound counterintuitive, but often the best way of using LitCrit is to disagree with it. Because most of the time, it's only by challenging someone's view do we really get to consider our own stance. Agreeing with a critic's view is possible, but much less interesting. And there's only so much that we can ever say if we do agree. Of course, that's not to say we must always seek to be contrarian, but a good approach is to conduct an imaginary discussion with multiple critics who hold different viewpoints, and to consider that if we disagree with the critic's view, why that is, and to make our case. And if we do happen to agree with another critic's view, what else we can add to it based on our own interpretation of the text. In general, if all we do is to say, this is what I think, and prominent critic so-and-so also thinks this, we run the risk of coming across uninspired in our arguments. Or worse, that we're just parroting the critic's ideas and repurposing it as our own. Now I'm going to demonstrate how we can write a paragraph by incorporating opposing critical viewpoints. For my primary text, I'll be using Macbeth. And for my secondary texts, I'll be citing from Stephen Greenblatt's article, Shakespeare Bewitched, and Emma Smith's book, This is Shakespeare, largely because they present rather different views on the presentation of witchcraft in Macbeth. So in addressing an essay topic like, how are the witches presented in Macbeth, I'll first consider what I think about this prompt. Well, I see the witches as playing various roles in the play. On the one hand, they function as a theoretical device for the effect of sensationalist spectacle, which would have appealed to superstitious playgoers back in Shakespeare's time. But on a deeper level, the witches are also a magnifier of human flaws. It isn't so much their curses and temptations that are the point, as it is how Macbeth reacts to the witches' supernatural solicitings that is so central to the message of the play. So you notice that I'm adopting a hybrid approach that looks at Macbeth from both a performative and a humanistic angle. But for someone like Stephen Greenblatt, who, by the way, I believe is one of the best Shakespearean critics alive, he sees the witches as playing a more metaphysical function. And he argues that Shakespeare uses these witches to interrogate the limits of theatre. By presenting on stage in concrete form what's supposedly taboo, supernatural, and therefore unreal, the bard confuses the line between truth and imagination, and in a way doesn't so much suggest witchcraft and potions as a great source of danger, as it is perhaps that drama and language are a great source of power, having the capacity to make real what's not, just like magic. As Greenblatt writes, Shakespeare is staging the epistemological and ontological dilemmas that in the deeply contradictory ideological situation of his time haunted virtually all attempts to determine the status of witchcraft, beliefs and practices. And he is at the same time and by the same means staging the insistent, unresolved questions that haunt the practice of the theatre. For Macbeth manifests a deep, intuitive recognition that the theatre and witchcraft are both constructed on the boundary between fantasy and reality, the border or membrane where the imagination and the corporeal world, figure and actuality, psychic disturbance and objective truth meet. The means normally used to secure that border are speech and sight. But it is exactly these that are uncertain. The witches, as Macbeth exclaims, are imperfect speakers, and at the moment he insists that they account for themselves, they vanish. But just pitching Jen versus Greenblatt isn't interesting enough. So let's now bring in an alternative critical view, this time by Emma Smith, Professor of Shakespeare Studies at Oxford, who often takes a broad, diverse approach to reading Shakespeare. But on the whole, I find that she leans more towards the historicist camp. So unlike Greenblatt, Smith posits that the witches don't actually serve such a serious role in the play, and are less, quote, active agents than passive predictors of how things will turn out. She also argues that Shakespeare, in writing Macbeth, was to a large extent stroking King James' ego buttons, and by doing so, establishing himself as a staunch Jacobean loyalist, being a mouthpiece for Jacobean hereditary monarchy, for his new King James, and for the Stuart dynasty safely cushioned by two young princes. However, the strong royal consciousness underlying Macbeth isn't something Greenblatt agrees with, as he writes in his analysis that, quote, no one in the Jacobean period, least of all Shakespeare's players themselves, understood the designation king's men to imply an official, prescriptive function. Neither Shakespeare nor his company were speaking dogmatically or even indirectly on behalf of any institution except the marginal, somewhat disreputable institution of the theatre. Disreputable precisely because it was the acknowledged house of fantasies. With all of that, if I were to write up a paragraph triangulating Greenblatt, Smith, and my own views, then it could look something like this. And that's it for this video, guys. I know this is another one of those heavy-duty videos with lots of content and details to digest, but hey, anything is worth it for top grades, right? But no worries, because you can obviously always rewatch this during your revision or refer to my blog post, which I'll link to in the description box below. But in any case, I hope this was helpful in terms of showing you the steps to including literary criticism in your own essays and how you can go about doing it effectively. As always, please hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and switch on that bell notification so you never miss a top grade English Lit study video from me. You can also follow me and direct message me over at my Instagram page at Hyperbolit. So make sure that you follow me there as well. And I'll see you guys in the next video.